go and get started, guys. Thank you so much for being patient. So today I want to talk to you about formative assessment. Whether you're writing formative assessment, using formative assessments, new to formative assessments, or you don't even know what a formative assessment is. I think I'm going to be able to share some things that I've learned through my experience in the classroom and working with teachers that perhaps can help create some new tools for you to use during this remote, and even when we're back face to face. Formative assessments just a major part of good practice. So having said that, I picked a particular image for my screen today. It's not play and catch content-wise, where we're throwing information to a scholar and wanting them to throw it back to us, but it is a picture of water and how fluid it is. So my challenge to you is, how fluid is your instruction? And so I think you need to take some things into consideration, like, is your teaching visually supportive? When you talk or you engage with students, is there an anchor format in place to help support that conceptual load for your teaching when you're not talking? You know, much of the time, I hear teachers say all the time, well, you know, I'm explaining that. Well, and I will say back to them, well, I hear you, but when you quit talking, what story are they playing in their head? And do they have a system and a format to be able to break down the information in such a way that they can process it in an unknown situation? And so that's what I mean about format during a conceptual load. And then, what is the purpose of the formative assessment? If the child only has to answer an ABCD, that's informing, but it's not so formative. If they actually have to use the words in context or incomplete thoughts, that's much more formative, because you can see where the breakdown in information is. Maybe it's in a way that they processed your information, or maybe they're just at an early onset of cognitive acquisition. And so the more writing and the more storytelling they can do inside of these formative assessments that is directly aligned to the standard, that's the best form of information that you're going to get. So remember, formative is things that happen more often. It can happen inside of a lesson cycle, can happen at the end of a lesson cycle. It can happen many times inside of one specific teach, but it absolutely needs to happen. So I wrote this position statement the other day because I kept getting some questions from my teachers, because when we talk, primarily in my district, we talk a lot about low-hanging fruit, and then we talk about fruit in general. So I just want to read this to you. Please read it, and then, you know, I'll ask for some thoughts, some of your thoughts or takeaways, and you can just put that in the chat for us. We live in a world where many focus on the fruit on the tree. They focus on the outcome and make decisions based on grabbing the fruit and ignoring that root, and then the tree dies. Don't overlook the fundamentals of the thinking that's aligned to the standard. If they can't tell you the story, then they don't know the understanding to the depth and rigor necessary, no matter how many nouns they use. And I use that a lot with my teachers because they'll say, well, they use the word photosynthesis, they use the word condensation, well, but they don't know the story, so it's all in isolation. So just make sure that you're mindful of the process and the very fundamentals of the thinking that's going to be required in order to be successful with the standard that you're using. Keeping in mind that we want to package our lessons and our thinking and our curriculum in such a way that we're covering power standards or essential standards to make the most of this lost instructional time. Now, as we move on to this slide, this is a phrase that I use often in my practice. It's just called tell the story. And so I want to apply that analogy I used earlier about root and fruit. So I'm going to show you how I built this formative assessment. So perhaps we can engage in conversation on how to build good questions around some roots in order to get to the fruit. So step one is the root. I train kids and teachers to break down experiments this way. What's the one thing I changed? What's the one thing am I measuring? What tool am I using to measure with? And then what increment does that tool use? So for instance, a child would be able to say, we're measuring speed, so I'm going to need a timing device. The thing that is changed, the actual variable that's changed will be the ramp height, but I need a timing device and it's going to measure it in seconds. So that child knows that seconds goes with timing device, which goes with speed. So all important information. So that would be the root, because that system is applied to almost every experiment we use. And then the fruit would simply be the actual experimental design that we put in front of them. So you can see the picture of the fruit here, which would be the one thing I'm changing the variable would be the surface type. This particular screenshot is an image off of EduSmart. So if you're not familiar with EduSmart, it is great for the nature of science process skills and for the Texas process skills, because it goes through a lot of these lab simulations and plays them out for the kids where they can make inferences and they can participate in the lab process, but do it in an online format. So I'm gonna also open up the chat so I can see what you guys are talking about. I'm gonna go to my next slide. So here's an example of
Hello, Paula.
Yes.
Paula, sorry, this is Sandeep. You know, we have an issue with the co-hosting, so just keep an eye on the people wanting to enter the webinar. As you see them, please let them in.
Okay.
Okay. Just
All
maybe
right.
check in every 5 minutes or so. And,
Got it.
yeah.
Okay. All right, so going back to this fruit and root, here's another formative assessment tool that I use for solutions. And this is aligned to the depth and the rigor of the standard, because the students have to be able to identify if it's a mixture or a solution, and then if a substance is actually going to be soluble, which means dissolves in water. And so the kids are actually testing here. So it's a great hands-on experiment inside of this online learning process. And so I just did a screenshot so we can see. So what would be some examples of some questions that you could check for understanding on this particular root? So the root is this lab engagement piece. So open up the chat and put in there some examples of some formative assessment questions that we could ask specifically about this image. Jerry?
Yes, okay, so.
I don't see any chat. Okay, just a second, now I see it, okay.
Okay.
So I have nothing so far. I'm assuming that they are.
We have Miata said, knowing the whole story will help students internalize the concept.
Absolutely. So give me some quick formative assessment questions. So one, I'll start. One would be, let's just start with chalk. What is chalk going to, what physical property of chalk? Well, what is going to happen when I add the chalk into the water? Is it soluble or is it not soluble? That would be a level 1 formative assessment question. So you would do this for each of the objects. A higher level formative assessment question might be, which of the following pieces of property are soluble, right? Because in order to do that, they would have to know the solubility of each of those. Just based on simple scientific fact, and because it's stated in the TEK, they would know how iron filings and pepper are going to behave. They also know how sugar is going to behave according to the state of Texas TEKs, because it's written in the standards. But that whole being able to leverage this image as a part of your visual literacy practice, and then creating these formative assessment questions or formative assessment activities for your children to participate in is huge. So that's how you take an image and move it forward.
So there's other answers. Paula, would you like some more?
Yeah, if there's anything else in the chat, and then I'll move on to the next one.
Okay, Thyra said, how could we separate a mixture of sugar, water, and iron filings?
Right, and so after, so you could definitely use that, but you would need to leverage that into the fact that something needs to dissolve in order for it to be soluble. And then the ultimate, so that's almost a formative to a summative, is how you would separate it back out. So that would be even a higher level thinking question, which is outstanding.
Melissa said, what method can you use to separate each mixture from the water?
Correct. And so we know that it's always hard because mixtures are easy to separate. Solutions are hard to separate. You have to have an increase of thermal energy. So we train our kids that takes some equipment, that takes time, that takes a lot of energy, right? In order to get rid of the water, to get back to what you started with. And so one other high level question you can ask is, you put 10 grams of salt in or 10 grams of sugar into the beaker and stirred it, the sugar dissolved. Well, what's the rest of the story? So you give them the first part of the story, and then you ask them for the end of the story. So how do I separate it back out? And then what am I left with? Because some students are under the misconception that it completely disappears, or some of that matter, some of that sugar would actually disappear. So all good takeaways and questions on that. I'm going to go ahead and move to the next slide. I'm asking you a question, a root to root comparison. These images I'm going to call as one image. So if these two pictures were on the slide in front of a child and I asked them, is this an example of constructing a model for sun, earth, moon? Is this an example of how I would analyze patterns? Or is this an example of how I would demonstrate day and night? What would they say? What would you say? So you can simply give me a 1, 2, or 3. 1 being construct, 2 would be the answer for patterns, 3 is the answer for demonstrate. Put that in the chat for me, and let's see what y'all come up with. What is this an example of? Constructing models, analyzing patterns, or demonstrating day and night? What do we have, Jerry?
We have 2 is the most common answer, demonstrating day and night. All of the above. Most people are saying 2, there was 1, 3, and we have an all of the above.
Okay, so this is what I'm going to say. Upon looking closer at the image, you may reevaluate your answer. But obviously this is not constructing a model of the sun, earth, moon, because constructing is an actual, it's the TEK is saying that the student needs to make the model. So these are not student made models. All right. And this is not an example of the sun, earth, moon inside of a model. Next, this is very much an analyzing patterns, because that's what the crosshairs does, is it allows you to build quadrants and to look at the activity inside the quadrants. And so that's the thing that the two pictures have in common. And that we also know what we're called to do based on moon phases and seasons is that it's a predictable pattern. This is a deceptive question a little bit if kids don't have enough background knowledge, that just because there's dark and light and it's in front of the earth, you might think that that represents day and night, but it does not. It represents what quarter the moon is in and the look of the moon. So this is not demonstrating day and night. This is very much demonstrating analyzing patterns. So you can see how just using an image that's aligned to the standard and asking these very short, specific prompts can get you to the depth of thinking on where the child is with mastery of information. So I'll move on. Let's look at this one, root to fruit using images. So this is an image that I might use for the water cycle on day 1 at the bottom. And then by day 2 or 3 in 4th and 5th grade, perhaps, maybe even third, that we would move to a more elaborate model, a more scientific model that demonstrates the water cycle. So as you look at these, I want you to also look at the questions I wrote for this particular formative assessment, which could actually be used as a summative assessment as well, if perhaps it had a little more writing on it. But you can see the level of the rigor that I'm actually trying to get at. How would you label both of these? If the child only says the bottom is the water cycle, and they don't have a title for the top, I'm thinking that they really don't know that this is an example of the water cycle and the movement of water by using energy. What's the source of heat in A? What's the source of heat in B? What do the arrows represent? Make sure that you're always familiar and you're drawing kids' attentions to arrows in science. The thing about arrows in science is that they don't always mean the same thing. An up arrow doesn't always mean the direction up. It might mean an increase in, okay? It might mean down might be actually going down, falling down, but it might be a decrease in. It might be a transition from one stage to another is what the arrow means. So you have to read specific arrows to specific pictures in science. And then you can see that I asked them a little bit of some open-ended stuff at the bottom. So root to fruit using an image. Here's another one, a root to fruit using an image. This is an image off of EduSmart. Which letter represents sunrise? This is a high-level question for this, aligned to the teak. Rotation of the earth happens every day, every 24 hours by the sun's apparent movement. The rotation of the earth, hugely tested standard for us. So which letter represents sunrise? And so they have to know, I'm showing them with an arrow which way the earth is rotating. So they have to be able to know this in reference to the sun. So we find that most of our kids after first teach, we're really only at a 50% on this question. And so it's a definite reteach for us. And it usually means we just need another touch point with the kids. So very good high level question. And I will move on. Next, construct a food web. I want you to put in the chat a good question, a good formative assessment question for this. If the task was to construct a food web for the child out of these images, what's a formative assessment question that I could ask? So go ahead and try your luck at it. Put one in the chat for us.
How will a missing link disrupt the web?
Yes. So what happens, and so one way we teach our kids to handle this very accurately is that if we're building the food chain inside of the web and we remove one of the organisms, we have to use that word organisms with our kids because a lot of our students will think plants aren't actually living and they're not called organisms. So we use an overabundance of that vocabulary word. So what would happen if I removed the rabbit, or the rabbit was removed out of the ecosystem because of some environmental event? What would the population do? What's the rest of the story? So what happens after the removal? And then what would happen before the removal when it comes to numbers, right? Organism numbers. So I would have a population increase before, because it would be removing a predator. And I have a population decrease afterwards because I'm decreasing a food source. So all good, making sure that you tie it back into telling the story of the standard. So here's an example of root to fruit using a performance assessment. If you've heard my training earlier on visual literacy, it talked a lot about using images and asking questions, right? And so this would be an example of of making this a formative assessment and giving kids the tools and telling them to drag and drop according to a challenge. So here's the formative challenge. Where would you place the switch for only 2 devices to work? Now place the switch on the grid for only 4 devices to work. So I'm thinking that the load of the cognition aligned to the standard, if they can do this correctly, then they understand circuits closed and open, and they understand the consequences of having, or the benefit of having the closed circuit and the consequence of having an open circuit. So really good to make sure that you maximize this good instruction that you're doing, these good images that you have, and then leverage it into these open-ended performance assessments for the kids without creating more work for yourself. Next, here's a simple one that I use, just using a simple image from EduSmart. Describe the process that led to this new landform. I would always give a word bank for the kids to use, but I would use tier 2 words like source. They might not use that word source. They might not use slow change in here. I probably wouldn't give them slow change if it was a formative assessment, because if they are not telling me that this is a very slow change that happens, or that this is new land created, that this is caused by a form of erosion that turns into deposition, because deltas are created by deposition. We say them together in Texas, delta deposition, so we can remember that. All good information that can come of that. But if you set the bar low and so open-ended, you might spend most of your time cleaning up their thinking instead of leveraging their thinking. So I would normally give them a few key words that they have to use in order to hit the mark. Here's an example of what I would call rigorous thinking. Another image used from EduSmart, really good nature of science images. Write the steps out in order to separate this solution and mixture. And then the high level, what separates this out between just meeting the expectation of the standard and then mastering it would be if they could draw a dot diagram of the particles of the salt solution and then the mixture of sand and water. If they can do this in a dot diagram after they've told me how they're going to separate it out, they have definitely hit the mark. So one way to leverage a picture from EduSmart and asking a solid question and then asking a very rigorous question, making sure that you put the cognitive load back on the child. Really good. So you're not spending the majority of your time as a teacher hunting and finding images, but you already have these images. You're just creating, you're stepping into your wheelhouse and creating these cognitive rigorous questions in order to leverage this good visual practice. Another example that was similar, this particular formative assessment has to do with objects in space, has to do with rotation and revolution. So it's 2-tiered with that cognitive load. So a very complicated picture, but one that they should definitely know by the end of those units. So this is a formative to a summative. Very good question with a writing piece at night that challenges them to describe a nighttime on Earth using the objects that they see here. So I love that particular one. It's one of my favorite formative assessment pieces. Here's another one on circuits, just one to ask a little bit differently. Here's another one on a food web that's, very complicated, but this would be an example of a particular food web that we would see on assessment questions in Texas. Here's a simplistic one that I would use at the beginning of a unit, talking about ecosystems and organisms and what's living and non-living found inside or identified inside of an ecosystem, and then how can I describe the relationships inside of the ecosystem? Is that a living to living? We call it L to L or L to NL, living to non-living, based on the needs of the organisms. Moving on, another image from EduSmart. There's not a question written, so I want to open up the chat real quick. What formative question could you write here given these 2 images? So hit me up with some questions in that chat.
Any questions?
Arlene, they're making me work this morning.
Yeah. Anybody
They're like,
in the
"Give it to
studio?
me." They know.
Anybody-
See, they're just like the kids. They know if they outweigh that 7 seconds, that I'm just going to give it to them. So
We have. Oh,
yes, you're right. But I'm going to hear your thoughts in a minute.
Okay,
if you
so
want to go ahead and type.
Aaron Robinson writes alike versus different. Mayata, it writes, how does water change land? Melissa, which model represents fast changes to the earth? Any other?
Great. So I like all 3 of those, and I could use them in combination with each other. So going from how are they alike, how are they not alike, then ramp it up. That's a great opening formative assessment question. Then ramp it up, because obviously you've taught them something, or maybe this is the initial image to rapid and slow change. Then come back to this image at the end of your lesson, and maybe your lesson was just on rapid change. And then revisit this picture, these images again, and ask them to use the appropriate vocabulary, telling me which one is rapid and which one is evidenced by slow, and just keep scaffolding your questions. So I think a good mindset to always have when you talk about that initial slide I shared with the considerations, how are you going to use it? Are you using these images as an engage? Are you using this formative assessment question as a hook and asking for, you know, discussion or background knowledge? What do you know? Or are you using it to check for learning after the teaching has happened? Or are you using it in more of a summative way, even though it's an early summative question, right? What steps came before this, and you know, what steps came after it, if we're talking about slow change? So all good points, all very good points.
And Sylvia adds, what physical forces are at work here? Thank
Perfect.
you, Sylvia.
Yeah, good. So now let's look at this one, soil water retention, the messiest lab in 4th grade science, specifically tied to soil types. Great visuals with the equipment by EduSmart here. I screenshotted this in midstream. You can see right in the mid pour here. But you know, this would be something that you could stop and clip and ask the kids to draw an inference, to extrapolate what's going to happen next. You know, based on our study of sand, silt, clay, and loam and particle size, we know some things to be true. Tell me the story of sand. And they might say large particle size, pretty far apart, right? Tell me the story of silt, because obviously you would want to teach them up before actually handling and doing this experiment, because it would make more sense so they could connect more of the learning. And so I would stop it and then ask them questions about telling you the story of particle size, because that's the key connection here with this particular lab and how it's going to behave when water's added to it. And then add the next step on, connect it forward to the learning all the way to life science. And then what particular plants would thrive in such a soil? What does the climate look like on these particular soil types? I mean, what would it look like for plants to survive in a particular climate? And then what soil would they thrive in? So all good teaching points provided there by EduSmart. And then another example of the power of erosion using a lab simulation with EduSmart. And then I'll end up with this, tying together lots of things, tying together rapid change and slow change, and how it's recorded visually. And then how I can extrapolate information from a data table in order to be predictive of and draw reference to when an actual rapid change happened. I love the visuals and the outlining of what the surface of the land looks like before and after. And then a key word, hurricane. Well, that's not a climate word, that's a weather word, right? Because that happens fairly quick. And then going back to the slow change of the water erosion, and then being predictive on when it happened. So having said that, that's another way just to use tables and charts for formative assessment. And then I'll just come back to this touch point with the slide. Once again, how fluid is your teaching? What is the purpose of your visual support for your scholars? Do you have enough of it? And just because you use it and play it, don't forget that you can screenshot it and leverage it forward, or stop playing it and ask these key formative assessment questions where you step in and make sure that the kids can truly understand and tell the story of that conceptual load of that standard. And then that's how I think you're going to hit the mark. And I know this to be true, that the teachers that really embrace this practice of high-level formative assessment check-ins really are just fantastic, engaging teachers, because kids own a part of the learning. Kids are a part of the stories. Kids love telling the stories, and they feel more engaged inside of a classroom. And regardless of if you're face-to-face or if you're remote, this is a major player for you, this use of formative assessment. So I want to stop there and just field any questions you may have for me.
Paula, there's a question from Thyra. Could you please post the root to fruit slide explanation again?
Yes. And I'll go ahead and take any other questions while I'm working on that.
Okay.
Okay.
We have some answers that we haven't covered, I think, but we don't have any other questions I see.
Sure.
And for everybody who is on this afternoon, you will be receiving a copy of the recording from Paula's presentation today, and the slide deck for your own use or follow-up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any other questions for Paula?
Do I need to? Yeah, go ahead.
Diana thanks you, and she really appreciates the webinar. And as far as the certificate goes, thank you for bringing that up. If once you receive a copy of the slide deck and the PowerPoint, please let us know if you want a certificate of attendance. EduSmart will be happy to provide that. And then Melanie writes, the analogy was great, and the examples that you used from EduSmart are wonderful. So thank you, Melanie, for sharing that as well. Any other questions? We have some nice compliments for you, Paula, here in the chat.
Always love those. Always love those.
Erin, what do you mean by your question? Are you able to provide some more details on how EduSmart is tweaking? Do you mean how we're changing the updates, or?
Yes. If we don't have an opportunity to go visit your sneak peeks, what are some things we can look forward to with EduSmart for this distance learning?
Yeah, we will be including, I can ask that we send all registrants a copy of a sneak peek webinar recording. Would that be helpful? Okay.
And Diana also asked, how can we aid the special ed students in conjunction with general ed teachers for the presentation? So again, a way to address the needs of the diverse learner.
Well, absolutely. So I think there's something specific to being able to have a conversation with your team that's servicing children, right? And not making the assumptions that people have to understand science to the level that you understand science as the teacher. And so once I got my head wrapped around that as an administrator and as a teacher, I was able to do a lot of really good work with the support staff for my children. And that's the beautiful thing about EduSmart, is that the non-degree, the person can sit alongside of these students and be hearing the same stories, which are aligned to the depth and the rigor and the complexity of the standards, right? So they're hearing this authentic learning, these stories being told, they're reading the readers, they're engaging in these simulations and interactivities. They are working through the note-taking guide with the anchors of support, and that's a new thing that's been updated for EduSmart that is really being leveraged well. I would say that for the most part, that is the #1 stopping point for SPED support, is to break down the obstacles that are in the way of the students being successful. And so by providing those word banks and those anchors of support that are dovetailed nicely with that note-taking guide that pairs with that instructional module or that video, that is the wheelhouse for SPED support. And then being able to step into those interactivities and those simulations and do the drag and drops and, you know, receive the positive feedback from there. I think that's your wheelhouse. So I would definitely bring in SPED support or language support, ELF support as well, because it's offered in English and Spanish. And it's such a powerful, wonderful tool. And especially with all the new updates, they've just made it even more accessible and stronger for all kids. So
Thank you,
please use
Paula.
it.
Sherry asks a good question. Are we able to copy and paste images from EduSmart to use to create formative assessment questions?
So I think that's not a Paula question. From EduSmart perspective, it's for your own personal use. That would be okay. We just ask that that not be shared widely, as it is EduSmart copyrighted intellectual property.
Thank you, Sandy.
Correct. And I would, you know, only put it up in front of your kids when you have subscriptions. But for the most part, the way I'm seeing it being leveraged out on campuses remotely is that campuses have subscriptions, and that the best success that we're having here is when we're doing synchronous teaching and the teacher is on the call with the students going through the modules. And so it's the power of the pause button. So that's how I would use it. Instead of screenshotting, I would pause the video clip and then right there ask the formative assessment questions to the children. And whether you putting it in the Google Doc or whatever, you know, platform you're going to use in order to communicate with the kids, but that's how I would do it in real time. That's the most success that we're having with kids, is being synchronous with EduSmart to answer the questions in real time and to leverage these formative assessment type questions in real time.
Thank you very much, Paula. Thank you, everybody, for your great words and your.
One more question. There's one more. Do we have time for it or no?
Okay, go ahead, Jerry.
From Sylvia, what other tools do you use for developing the visuals our students need to, quote, tell the story? Paula.
Well, I just use EduSmart because I waste more time going to Google Image than I do EduSmart, just pausing. Just the way that EduSmart is packaged, the simplicity of it, but then the realistic images that can be leveraged to more rigorous thinking, but also can be scaffolded back down to simple thinking, to the base thinking of the standard. So you can always lace in some Google images, you know, into your own private practice, but just being more visually literate. We currently have a textbook in the state of Texas that is very below the standard of online reading. It's more like a highlights magazine, but it's so very visual. That's another place that we get free images, because we have to buy a textbook for every child, and we're not using those textbooks at all because they're written too low for to hit the standard for the assessments for the state of Texas, but they have great pictures in them. And so we're using those books as a source of visual literacy. And then also, don't forget, you have online libraries. And I just tell my student, like, we read down to maybe 2 or 3 grade levels below. I'm not looking at those books for the literacy piece. I'm looking at them for the visual piece, because those are great picture books. And then we leverage up with formative assessment questions and the Just Right literacy. So the answer to the question is yes, all of the above.
Thank you. We pride ourselves at EduSmart with being a visual literacy component for science with all our components that are embedded in the curriculum. I want to thank everybody for attending, and I want to also share with you again, if you attended, you'll be getting a copy of Paula's recording, a copy of Paula's presentation. I saw some people in the chat that are interested in a certificate of attendance. Please respond once you get this package that you are interested in a certificate of attendance, and our marketing department will share that with you. And I also am very excited to share our next lunch and learn session that'll be provided by Dr. Ava Rosales. And Ava, can you share with us what you'll be presenting on August 12th for our next lunch and learn session?
Certainly. Thank you, Arlene. We'll focus on questioning strategies, specifically essential questions and power standards, so that we can learn how to maximize learning with limited time.
Thank you very much, Ava, and we'll be sending that invitation out to you shortly. On behalf of the EduSmart team, I want to thank Paula, and I want to thank you, the science educators, for joining us, and we hope to see you August the 12th. Thank you.
Bye, guys. Thanks.
Thanks
Paula.
everyone.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for being here.
Thanks, Paula.
Thank you.